In the early evening of July 19, 2000, 22-year-old Misty Morris carried her surfboard out of the water and onto the beach in Indian Harbor Beach, Florida. She laid the board down on the sand, then sat down next to it to catch her breath. Her heart was still racing from the last wave she had just caught, and the adrenaline was exactly what she needed. Between her waitressing job and her sales clerk job and the community college courses she was taking, she basically had no time to do anything for herself. And so to get out here and to be out on the ocean and just be away from it all was not only a great respite, but was also very calming for her. And so, looking out over the horizon, she dug her feet into the sand and watched the waves until her heart rate finally slowed down. After a few minutes, Misty got back up and carried her board over to some rocks where she had left her bag. She needed to check the time, because she was going out with her friends later, and she still needed to get home to shower and have dinner and get ready. And as she reached her bag, she heard her phone ring. So she pulled it out and saw the name of the person who was calling her, Ricky Franklin. And she was about to pick it up, but then she stopped. Ricky was one of the guys that she was seeing. They'd gone out with some friends together yesterday and then watched a movie afterwards, just the two of them. But Misty wasn't so sure. Ricky was a sweet guy, but he called a lot, and Misty had a feeling he wanted to be more serious than she did. And she just wasn't looking for that, because she was having fun sort of dating around. Aside from Ricky, she was also seeing another guy named Teddy Underwood, who she actually did really like. Misty worked with Teddy's sister at a restaurant, and they'd gone out a few weeks ago, and it had been great. They had a lot in common, and it just felt easy to be around him. So she hoped that they would keep on hanging out, and who knows, maybe that would become more serious, and maybe she'd be open to that. So Misty let Ricky's call go to voicemail, and then tossed her phone back in her bag. She wasn't quite sure what she was going to do with him yet, but she figured she would talk it out with her friends later that night. Misty checked the time and saw it was 7 p.m., so she had to hurry. She peeled off her wetsuit and organized her things, and as she was getting ready to go, she heard barking. And she turned and saw this shaggy dog run past her with its owner. And immediately, it gave Misty this wave of sadness, because it reminded her of her old dog, Chiba. Misty used to share Chiba with her ex-boyfriend, Brent Huck, and she loved that dog more than anything. But when she and Brent broke up and Misty moved in with her mom, her apartment complex didn't allow for dogs. So Misty had to leave Chiba behind, and she really missed her. But Misty had seen Chiba a few times recently, because Brent, despite being her ex, was actually still another person that Misty was seeing right now. Just more like a friends with benefits thing, not a relationship. Now, Misty knew this very likely was a bad idea, because their relationship had been fraught with drama. And Brent now had a girlfriend as well. But being with him felt nice and familiar, and plus she got to see the dog, so she'd been putting off ending things. And so Brent was yet another thing she was planning to talk about that night with her friends. And so after watching the dog and the owner run off, Misty turned, dusted the sand off her legs, picked up her board, and walked off the beach, headed for home. Less than 10 minutes later, Misty walked into the apartment she shared with her mom, Linda, and dropped her stuff next to the door. She made her way into the kitchen, where there was a big plate of lasagna her mother had left for her, along with a note that read, "Sleeping, eat up." This was pretty typical. Misty's mom, Linda, was a bookkeeper, and so she always had to get up really early in the morning to get to work, and so she was usually in bed by the time Misty got home at night. And so Misty happily grabbed a fork and sat down at the table to dig in. And as soon as she did, her phone rang. And when she checked it, she sighed, because it was Ricky again. This time, though, she decided to answer it and see what he wanted. And he told her he was just calling to touch base, and also wanted to make sure they were still on for Friday. Misty felt sort of annoyed by this, but she did tell him they were good for Friday, and then they talked for maybe a minute or so before she told him that she had to go. After dinner, she spent the next few hours watching TV and texting her friends about their plans for the night. They were all going to drive to the Holiday Inn Beachside Hotel bar, which was just a short drive south. A little after midnight, Misty took a shower and did her hair. Then she tiptoed to her mother's room and pushed open the door. She could see her mom sleeping in the darkness and felt bad waking her up. However, Misty did want to check in before she went out. So she walked over and gently shook her mother awake. And when Linda opened her eyes, Misty did a spin and asked how she looked. And even though she was very groggy, Linda smiled and said, "You look great." Misty gave her a kiss and said she was heading out in the next hour or so, but she'd be home tomorrow. And also, could she borrow her mother's car to see a movie? Linda mumbled yes and closed her eyes again. Then Misty slipped back out of the bedroom. And about an hour and a half later, Linda woke up again. And when she did, she heard the sound of Misty's cell phone ringing just outside of her room. Three days later, on a Sunday afternoon, a man was at his home on the banks of the Indian River, located about 22 miles away from Misty's home. He'd gone outside to enjoy the last few moments of his weekend, and he was just taking in his beautiful view of the water. However, when he walked down to the edge of the river, he noticed something floating in the current towards him. It was large, gray, and slick, and even from several feet away, he could tell it was a dead manatee, which actually was not unusual for the area. The Indian River was a mix of salt and freshwater, and it was connected to the ocean, so it was a big feeding ground for manatees. But when this manatee floated past him, the man's stomach twisted, because now that he was getting an actual close-up view, he realized it was not a manatee at all. The man stumbled backwards, then turned around and ran to his house to call 911. Within the hour, Agent Gary Harrell, who was an investigator with the Brevard County Sheriff's Department, stood on a dock downriver from a private home on the Indian River in Florida, and he was staring at the water, where the body of a dead woman with reddish-brown hair floated face down near the dock, caught between some trees and some rocks. All around Harrell, the area was swarming with investigators, taking photos and looking for evidence. A dive team was also nearby, preparing to wade into the river with a body bag to get the floating woman onto dry land so Harrell could examine her. Harrell didn't want to rush them, but at the same time, he did need them to hurry, because the longer the body was in the water, the more physical evidence the current would wash away. And it wasn't just the loss of tissues or fibers that Harrell was worried about, it was also the condition of any wounds on her body that might tell him how she died. Both moving water and marine life could damage a body, which could obscure the cause of death. The only information Harrell had at this moment was that this woman had been spotted floating down the river by a man who ended up calling 911. And Harrell didn't know who she was, how she got in the water, whether this was accidental or intentional, and now it seemed like the water was washing away any clues that might help him figure all that out. So Harrell watched anxiously as the dive team wrapped the woman in the bag and then pulled her onto shore. Once she was on dry land, Harrell hurried over to take a look. And as soon as he laid eyes on the body, he knew he had enough evidence to make at least one determination. This was no accident. This woman had been murdered. She was naked, and there was white duct tape across her eyes, and some loose tape that was around her neck, which Harrell assumed had at one point been in her mouth, but then slid down. Her hands and feet were also bound, except by rope, and Harrell could see that the rope she was tied up with was sort of unusual. It was a red and white diamond pattern with a big knot in it. There were also 2 ripped plastic bags that were tied to her feet, which Harrell guessed had once contained rocks or something else that was heavy to weigh her down. They very likely at some point ripped on the rocky river bottom, and then at that point she floated up to the surface. So whoever killed her must have tried to sink her body in hopes that it would never be found. Harrell just shook his head. He also suspected, since the woman was naked, that she had been the victim of sexual assault as well. But that was all he could guess right now. The woman was so bloated and already so decomposed, he couldn't even tell how old she was. He assumed she'd been in the water for at least a few days, which meant it was unlikely they'd be able to recover any DNA or forensic evidence from her body. But Harrell did have a few things to work with. The rope could be analyzed. It had that distinctive pattern, so it might be traceable. Harrell also made a mental note to show it to the Coast Guard too, in case there was a boating or marine connection. And he was excited about the duct tape. Tape is an adhesive and can collect and hold onto things like hair or skin or other materials, even in a harsh underwater environment. So Harrell asked a nearby crime tech to photograph and bag all the items and then get her body ready to transport to the coroner's office. Harrell hoped the medical examiner would be able to find some more clues during the autopsy, like how his victim died, when she died, and most importantly, her name. The following afternoon, so July 24th of 2000, Harrell parked his cruiser in front of an apartment complex in Indian Harbor Beach. He'd just come from the autopsy, and he had been right about the condition of the woman's body. It was so deteriorated, the medical examiner couldn't figure out when she died or how she died. He couldn't even tell whether she was alive or dead when she went into the water. But the medical examiner's best guess was that she either drowned or she suffocated from the tape or from someone putting a hand over her mouth and nose to smother her. She didn't have any drugs in her system, and there were no bullet wounds, stab marks, or broken bones. There was also no evidence of sexual assault that they could see, but again, it was very hard to tell. And even though there were a lot of unknowns here, this examination had told Harold a few key things. The first was that his victim was not thrown into the river from a bridge or cliff because she didn't have that kind of trauma or physical injury to her body. Whoever had killed her had most likely dropped her sort of gently into the water, likely from a boat. And the woman did not have any defensive wounds, which could mean a lot of things. Like, for example, maybe her killer had a weapon, and they used that to scare her into compliance without any sort of physical fight. But Harold thought it was more likely that she didn't physically fight back because she knew and trusted her killer. For one thing, women are more likely to be killed by an intimate partner. And also, there was no evidence of sexual assault, and that made a stranger attack a lot less likely, since she was not targeted for the purpose of assaulting her. She was targeted for potentially something very personal. Plus, there was the tape over her eyes. Harold didn't think that was about the killer protecting their identity. There was no chance of a dead victim identifying you. Harold thought it was the kind of thing you do if you know your victim personally, and you can't stand your victim staring at you while you kill them. But the biggest lead Harold had gotten from this autopsy was her identity. They had taken the woman's fingerprints and found a match. She was 22-year-old Misty Morris. So now Harold was in front of Misty's apartment, where he'd learned she lived with her mom, Linda Morse. And as the detective sat in his car, he took a deep breath, because no matter how many times he had done this, notifying loved ones about a death was always awful. As he made his way to the door and knocked, he felt this pit in his stomach. Moments later, a woman opened the door. Harold figured this had to be Linda, and as soon as he introduced himself, he saw her facial expression change. She gasped, and her eyes filled with tears as she asked, "It was her, wasn't it?" Harold was sort of caught off guard before he realized that news outlets had already been reporting that a body had been found in the river. Now, they had not released Misty's name yet, but he guessed that Linda must have seen the news and had been filled with dread ever since that was her daughter. So he just replied that yes, it was her, and her death looked like a homicide. And when he said that, Linda just broke down and began to sob. About a half an hour later, Harold was sitting inside the apartment, across the kitchen table from Linda. She had calmed down enough to give a statement, but she was still having trouble speaking. In a shaky voice, she told Harold that the last time she saw her daughter was 4 days earlier, on July 20th. She said Misty had woken her up after midnight to say goodbye, and then she left a while later to go out and see some friends at a bar. Linda began to cry as she explained she hadn't seen or heard from Misty since, and she'd been so worried. But Misty was an adult who went to college and worked and had a robust late-night social life. And so despite her worry, she told herself it was okay. Also, they had opposite schedules most of the time, so it was sort of normal to go a few days without seeing each other. Linda had not even tried calling her daughter until Friday, which was over 24 hours since the last time she saw her, and Misty didn't pick up. Then, Linda said on Sunday she had heard that a body had been found. And when she said that out loud, Linda sort of trailed off, unable to continue. Harold just sat there quietly as Linda tried to gather herself. He felt certain that her grief was very real, and he would love nothing more than just to leave her alone. But it was also critical that he get as much information about his victim from her as possible. So, once Linda seemed to be a little bit more composed, Harold asked her if there was anything else she could think of. Linda frowned, and for a moment she was quiet. But then she said, yes, actually there was. After Misty said goodbye to her that night, Linda said she fell back asleep. But then very shortly after she fell asleep, she woke up again to the sound of Misty's cell phone ringing in the other room. And then shortly after that, she heard the phone ring for a second time. So clearly her daughter had gotten 2 calls before she went out. Linda said she couldn't hear what was said or who the caller was on either of these calls, but it seemed like whoever was calling her was going to be the one giving Misty a ride. Harold wrote this down, and then, with Linda's permission, he took a look at Misty's bedroom. He didn't see anything significant, but he did take note of the fact that Misty's driver's license and her phone were not in there. Those 2 items had not been found with her body, so it was possible that her killer had them or had tossed them. Before he left, Harold got the name of the bar that Misty said she had been going to that night, as well as the name of some of her friends who were going to be there. Harold wanted to see if Misty had ever actually arrived. Later that night, Harold headed back into his office and sat down at his desk. The whole day had been nonstop, and he was exhausted. Harold and his team had spent hours locating and interviewing Misty's friends, and they all said that Misty never showed up to meet them at the bar, and that no one had talked to her since. This meant that whoever called Misty before she left home, in particular the second phone call, where apparently Linda thought she overheard that person signaling they were coming to pick Misty up, well, that possibly was the last person Misty spoke to. And if Misty's mom was right that that person had come to pick Misty up, well, they might very well be the killer. So Harold had pulled Misty's phone records, and they did indeed show that Misty had received 2 phone calls roughly around the time that Linda believed she heard the sound of 2 phone calls. However, in the year 2000, when this took place, phone records did not include the name or number of the caller. So the only thing Harold could see was what time the calls were made and how long they lasted, not who made them. He could see that Misty got one call at 1:58 a.m. that was very quick, and then she got another quick call at 2:23 a.m. And then after that, her phone was not used again. Even without a name or number of the caller or callers, this record was huge. And so even though Harold didn't know for sure if these 2 calls were made by the same person, given the fact that Linda said she overheard her daughter clearly making some sort of plan about getting picked up when she took these phone calls, it seemed likely that both of these calls were made by the same person who was coming to pick Misty up. And if that's true, well, we know Misty didn't arrive at the bar, and so very likely this caller was her ride, and her ride was her killer. None of Misty's family or friends said they were the ones who called Misty or picked her up that night. However, Harold was told that Misty was dating at least 2 different guys, and maybe one of them had given her a ride. Harold had these guys' names, and some officers were already doing some background checks on them. Just then, Harold's phone rang, and when he picked it up, he was very excited to hear it was the Coast Guard. And they had gotten a chance to look at that red and white rope that was used to tie Misty's hands, and they told Harold it looked like the kind that was used on sailboats. And they said the knot that was tied in it was very distinct. It was called a cow hitch knot, and it was taught in the Navy. Harold leaned back and smiled, because he could now add another detail to the profile he was building. He was looking for a suspect that had access to a boat and connections to the Navy or military. So Harold quickly thanked the Coast Guard and hung up, and then went to go update his officers on the call. And when he did this, one of them said something that sent Harold's heart racing. The backgrounds on the guys Misty was dating had come back, and one of them, Teddy Underwood, was a convicted felon with a history of sexual battery. And before Harold could even respond, the officer added that they had already picked Teddy up, and right now he was waiting for Harold in a nearby interrogation room. A few minutes later, Harold walked into that interrogation room and sat down across a table from Teddy. Now, based on Teddy's criminal history, Harold expected him to be hostile or maybe defensive, which would have prevented Harold from getting good information from him. So Harold had planned to start with very friendly, non-aggressive questions and just hope that Teddy got relaxed enough to maybe let something slip. But Teddy was not what Harold expected at all. He was polite, cooperative, and seemed genuinely stunned to hear that Misty was dead. And when Harold asked about a Navy connection and a boat, Teddy said no to both. He also had an alibi. He said he was with some friends early in the morning of the 20th, and then he gave Harold their information to confirm it. Then Teddy leaned forward and told Harold he knew that he very likely looked guilty here because of his criminal history. But he said he did not kill Misty, and he would do whatever Harold needed to help solve this thing, including giving police a DNA sample. Harold was sort of shocked, because he just hadn't expected this level of cooperation. But Harold said yes immediately to Teddy's offer. Now, the crime scene techs had not found any forensics on Misty's body, and the rope and the tape were still being examined, but Harold still had hope, and he wasn't going to miss a chance to get a swab from one of his best suspects. Plus, Harold knew it was possible that Teddy was pretending to be cooperative as a manipulation tactic. In the year 2000, DNA testing technology was not nearly as advanced or as fast as it is today, and so Teddy could be banking on the water having washed away any testable evidence. But regardless, Harold jumped up and said that a detective and a forensics tech would be in shortly, and then Harold headed back to his desk. And when he got there, he called the phone numbers of the people that Teddy had given him to confirm his alibi, and when he called them, each one confirmed the alibi, which meant Teddy could be accounted for during the time Misty was likely killed. However, an alibi and a DNA sample were still actually not enough to completely eliminate Teddy, especially since Misty's time of death was just a theory. But Harold knew for now he would need to move on to other suspects. Just then, a uniformed police officer appeared at Harold's desk with a message from the medical examiner's office. They had found a few short hairs on the white duct tape from Misty's body. And this really intrigued Harold because Misty had long hair. And hair on a body that did not belong to the victim usually belonged to the killer. But the Brevard County Sheriff's Department did not have the capacity to do that level of advanced DNA analysis, which meant that the last phone call Harold made for the evening was to the FBI labs in Quantico, Virginia. This was where most local police sent DNA for testing. Unfortunately, though, those kinds of tests took a long time. So as Harold arranged with the FBI to send the hairs from the duct tape along with Teddy's DNA down to Quantico, he knew he would not get any answers for at least a few months. On July 25th, so 2 days after Misty Morris's body was found in the river, Detective Gary Harold parked his cruiser in front of a house that belonged to a man named Ricky Franklin. Ricky was the second man that Misty's family and friends said she was dating, and according to them, he and Misty had been on a few dates and spoke often. But Misty had also told people that she was not nearly as interested in Ricky as Ricky was in her. Harold had his team do a background check on Ricky, and they hadn't seen anything suspicious in his history. But a one-sided attraction was definitely something that Harold needed to look into. And now, sitting in his cruiser, Harold saw something else that set off alarm bells. There was a boat in Ricky's front yard. Shortly after seeing this boat, Harold had Ricky inside of a police interrogation room. Harold had decided to do the interview at the station rather than at Ricky's house. That way Harold could have more control over the conversation, which had apparently been a good idea, because Ricky was a mess. He was incredibly flustered and kept crying as he explained that he'd only heard yesterday that Misty was dead. Harold knew he needed to calm Ricky down if he wanted this to go anywhere, so he told Ricky to take a breath and to just start with how he knew Misty. Ricky stammered as he said they met about 2 weeks ago and went on a date last Tuesday, the 18th, a day and a half before she was killed. They had some drinks with friends and then watched a movie together. They did have plans on Friday, and so he'd been calling her every day to confirm them and thought she was just kind of blowing him off when she wasn't answering. And then his voice broke as he said to the detective that even though he had just met Misty, he loved her. At the mention of these repeated phone calls that Ricky said he was making to Misty basically every day, Harold sat up a bit straighter and then asked Ricky point blank if he had spoken to Misty on the phone in the early morning hours of July 20th, like after midnight. And Ricky said no. He said he called her the night before on the 19th at about maybe 7 or 7:30, and then also a few times throughout the day on the 20th, but he did not call her in the middle of that night. Harold jotted this down. Now, Ricky could be lying, but even if he was telling the truth, it didn't mean he was innocent. It was sort of crazy that Ricky was already in love with Misty, and if Ricky felt rejected or angry she was seeing other people, well, then he had a motive. And also, the fact that he called her multiple times after she was already likely dead could have been an intentional ruse to make himself seem innocent. However, a hunch, along with there just being a boat parked in the front of his house, was not enough for an arrest here. Also, Ricky did not have a Navy background, or at least said he didn't, and he said he was home with his family during the time Misty was likely killed, and he quickly volunteered that, Harold could talk to his entire family, and they would all confirm that he really was home. And so likely his alibi was actually legit. And so feeling disappointed, Harold told Ricky he could go and he would be in touch. And then right as Ricky was about to leave, he stopped and told the detective that he almost forgot something. He said he had something of Misty's that the police likely wanted. And then Ricky pulled out his wallet. From it, he pulled out Misty's driver's license and gave it to Harold. Harold just stared at the license in shock. This license, along with Misty's phone, had not been found on her body, and they were missing from Misty's room, and so Harold had assumed her killer must have them. And now here was Ricky offering up a murder victim's property like it was nothing. Ricky must have sensed the new tension in the room, because he quickly explained that when they went on a date last Tuesday, 2 days before her murder, Misty didn't have any pockets and didn't want to carry her license around. And so she'd asked Ricky to hold on to it, and he just forgot to give it back. Harold nodded, but now his mind was racing. suddenly this whole interview felt like Ricky was just trying to get ahead of any evidence that connected him to the murder. And so that's when Harold decided to take a risk, and he asked Ricky if they could go take a look around his property. And to his surprise, Ricky agreed. The next day, 3 days after Misty was found in the river, Harold walked up yet another walkway to knock on yet another door. They had searched Ricky's house and boat and had not found any of what they were looking for. No red and white rope or white duct tape or really anything that could be connected to the crime. And also, Ricky's father had confirmed that Ricky really was home during the time Misty was likely picked up and killed. However, during this property search, Ricky had actually offered up another suspect, Misty's ex-boyfriend, Brent. According to Ricky, Brent had been abusive while he was dating Misty. Now, at first, Harold thought Ricky was just trying to point the finger at somebody else, so he had followed up with Misty's mom, Linda. But Linda had confirmed it. Misty's ex, Brent Huck, had been very possessive, and their relationship had been really rough, and it ended about a year ago. Following his discussion with Linda, Harold had some of his officers do a background check on Brent, and he was stunned at what came up. Brent had gone through naval training, but he was kicked out for not passing a swim test. Now, Brent worked as a private charter boat captain, and he owned multiple boats. And Brent's house was even on the Indian River, right near where Misty's body was found. And so Brent literally had all the criteria Harold was looking for in a suspect. And so once Harold reached the front door, he knocked, and right away he heard a dog barking inside, then footsteps coming towards him. A man opened up with a large, very friendly-looking dog panting right behind him, and the man asked Harold what he wanted. A few minutes later, Harold was inside the house, sitting in the living room with Brent Huck and his dog Chiba, who kept nuzzling Harold's knee. Brent was explaining that the reason he had this dog was actually because of Misty. She had bought Chiba when they lived together, but her new place had a no pets policy, so Chiba stayed with Brent when they split up. As Brent spoke, Harold noticed how calm he was, which could either be the demeanor of an actually innocent person or of somebody trying to seem innocent. Harold wasn't sure yet, so he asked Brent to tell him more about Misty and their relationship. Brent said they broke up a year ago, but he still cared about her, and actually they'd still been seeing each other on and off. He said the last time they slept together was July 11th, 9 days before she was killed. But they were keeping their relationship a secret since Brent had a serious girlfriend. Harold was amazed Brent was being so candid here. If what he was saying was true, then he definitely had a motive for killing Misty, like if he was worried that his current girlfriend would find out about them. So Harold pressed harder, and he asked Brent whether he saw Misty early in the morning on the 20th or whether he picked her up. But Brent said no. He said he had been at a bar and then partied with his friends before a girl dropped him off at his parents' house around 4 a.m. Brent was cooperative and answered every question that Harold threw at him. And so finally, Harold told Brent they would want to talk to him again, but at the station, and he would be in touch. As Harold left the house, he couldn't shake this feeling that Brent had to be their guy. Now, he was not acting guilty, and possibly he did have an alibi, but the details of his life, the Navy background and the boats, and his ongoing secret sexual relationship with Misty made him a perfect match for the suspect Harold had been looking for. However, this was also the third time that Harold had been certain he had found his killer. And in the other two instances, he had found some fact that made his theory impossible. And so he knew he was going to need something much stronger than just a profile based on circumstantial evidence if he wanted to connect any of his possible suspects to Misty's murder. For the next 2 months, Harold obsessed over this case. He thought about it at work. He thought about it at home. He thought about it when he laid in bed at night. He just went over and over the details again and again, including his suspects. Harold had confirmed Brent's alibi with the girl who had given him a ride, which meant that at the time Misty was receiving phone calls from her killer very likely and then also being murdered, Brent was out with friends. But he did have a few boats and a Navy connection, and he was also involved in a love triangle with Misty, which gave him a motive. Teddy Underwood, who had been seeing Misty casually, was a felon with a history of violence, but he willingly gave up his DNA, which could mean he had nothing to hide, or it could mean he was confident that the river would have washed away any evidence. And it might have, since Harold still had not received those DNA results back yet. Then there was Ricky Franklin, who was falling in love with Misty even though she didn't really care about him, which he seemed to know, which might have given him a motive. He also had a boat, and he had her license in his possession. But they also had not found anything incriminating when they searched his property. And so all of these men knew Misty well and were romantically involved with her. She certainly would have trusted each of them enough to let them pick her up, but they all had alibis. However, the time frame Misty died in was just an estimate, so Harold could not fully eliminate anyone just because of that. So Harold agonized over his list until September when his phone rang. When he picked up, a lab tech from the FBI was on the other end. They said they had finished looking over the hair samples Harold had sent over, as well as the swab from Teddy Underwood. And what they discovered was Teddy was not a match for this hair. But when Harold heard what the tech said next, he felt almost dizzy. Because the tech was absolutely certain, even without conducting additional DNA testing on Ricky or Brent, that the hair found on that duct tape on Misty's body was not going to match any of Harold's suspects. However, this actually was a good thing, because it told Harold everything he needed to know. Based on the police investigation and forensic evidence, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to Misty Morris in the early morning hours of July 20th, 2000. At 1:58 a.m. on July 20th, the killer sat at their home with their phone pressed to their ear, listening to it ring. When Misty picked up, the killer told her they wanted to talk. Misty told them she already had plans, but the killer said they really wanted to see her. And when Misty said yes, the killer said they'd be right over. Then they hung up, jumped in their car, and started driving. And as they drove, the killer gripped the wheel tightly, angrily. They had just lied to Misty. They didn't want to talk to her. They wanted to hurt her, because Misty had ruined their life. And tonight, they were going to finally show her how angry she had made them. They got to Misty's apartment at 2:23 a.m., at which point they called her to say they were there. Minutes later, the killer saw Misty come outside and began walking towards them. And when Misty opened up the car door and climbed inside, the killer pretended like everything was just fine and told Misty if it was okay with her, they were going to drive back to their place and they could talk there. Misty said, sure, and so the killer casually turned the car around and headed down the road. Once the killer finally arrived back at their house and parked, the two of them climbed out, went inside, at which point the killer told Misty to make herself comfortable. And then the killer left and went into the other room and grabbed a few things they knew they would need for what they were about to do, which was rope and duct tape. Then the killer returned to where Misty was, and she was sitting with her back to them. And so as quietly as they could, the killer snuck up right behind her, and before she could scream, they reached out in front of her with the duct tape and pulled it tight over her mouth. Misty began to struggle, but she was so confused and shocked by what was happening, the killer was easily able to get rope around her hands as well and tie it in a knot. Misty looked at the killer, both pleading and confused, like, what's happening? And the killer couldn't stand to have her watching them, because it made them ashamed and even angrier. So they put more duct tape on her face, this time on her eyes. The killer could clearly hear her struggling to get loose and struggling to breathe, but they ignored her, and instead took off all her clothing and then gathered up the other supplies they would need: plastic grocery bags, rocks, and some more rope. The killer then carried the struggling Misty outside out to the water and put her onto a boat. They hopped on after her, untied the mooring, then floated out to the middle of the Indian River. And then, once they were out in the deepest part of the river, the killer casually tied bags of rocks around Misty's ankles and dumped her overboard. Misty immediately sunk below the surface and vanished. The killer waited for a long time, but Misty never came back up. So they eventually steered their boat back to shore, then headed inside their home and went to sleep, with their beloved dog curled up at their feet. It would turn out the hair that Harold had sent to the FBI lab was not human hair. It was dog hair. And investigators eventually matched it to Misty's beloved dog, Chiba, who now was living with Brent Huck. The night Misty died, Brent really was at a bar. But while he was there, he heard a rumor from his friends that Misty was apparently pregnant. Now, it was not true, she was not pregnant, But for a moment, Brent panicked that it was true, and that maybe the child was his. And even worse, his current girlfriend, who he was serious about and wanted to marry, she might find out and leave him. So even though he actually did have a friend, that girl, drive him home that night, it was way earlier than he or that friend had initially claimed, giving him plenty of time to pick up and then kill Misty. But unfortunately for Brent, the tape that he used to bind Misty had, of course, those hairs from Chiba on it. Brent was ultimately convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and was given 2 life sentences. A few days before New Year's Eve in 2018, a woman in her 70s named Jane Benchley stepped through the front door of her New Brunswick, Canada home after walking her terrier around the block. She called out for her 81-year-old husband, Louis, but the house was quiet. Jane checked their bedroom, then the bathrooms, and even looked in the backyard. And just as she started to worry, she heard Louis's voice from down the hall. She opened the door to what used to be his office. Inside, her husband was hunched over his desk, looking at dusty old accounting logs and muttering to himself. Jane was surprised to find him there. Louis had retired years ago and hardly ever used the office anymore. When Jane asked him what he was doing, Louis slammed his fist down. Then he shoved the folders to the floor, leapt to his feet, and began shouting about how he'd been cheated. A supplier overcharged him for lumber on a contracting job, and he was furious about it. Jane tried to calm him down by reminding Louis that he'd sold his construction business years ago. Any money conflicts from old projects were water under the bridge now. But Louis was not having it. He just stood there angrily shaking his head and fell silent. Jane left the office to give her husband some space to sort through his anger on his own. But at dinner later that night, Louis was still fuming. He barely spoke. Jane couldn't understand why he was so fixated on financial matters from ages ago, but she just hoped a good night's sleep would clear his head. But the next day, Jane returned to the house after running some morning errands to find her husband acting totally frantic again. This time, it was about his appearance. He pointed to his head in a panic and asked why his hair was white. Jane didn't know what to say. She told Louis that nothing had changed and that his hair had been white for a long time. But he brushed her off and stormed out of the room. Jane had a bad feeling. Momentary confusion was one thing, but her husband's strange behavior the last couple of days seemed like something much more serious. So, she went to the office where Louis was, and she asked him a simple question. What year was it? And his answer floored her. He said it was 1992, but it was not. That was 26 years earlier. And so now Jane was frightened. Despite his age, Louis hadn't shown any signs of dementia before yesterday. But today, his grasp on reality seemed to be slipping by the hour. Jane found herself wondering if this might be some extremely aggressive form of Alzheimer's. And so she grabbed her phone to book Louis the next available appointment with his doctor. That night, Jane did her best to try to relax. She sat down in front of the TV with a cup of tea, but no matter what she did, she just couldn't stop worrying about her husband. As she got up to pour a new cup, she heard a loud crash from down the hall. Jane rushed towards the noise and swung open the office door. Inside, the floor was covered in shattered pieces of Louis's desk lamp. Behind the desk sat Louis, thrashing in his chair with his eyes rolled back in his head. Jane rushed to his side and tried to calm him down, but his body was spasming out of control. All she could do was hold his limbs and try to keep Louis from smashing anything else. Gradually, the seizure did subside, and once Louis was breathing normally, Jane grabbed her phone, purse, and keys and guided her husband to the car. Her mind raced as she drove him to the hospital. What in the world was going on with her husband? Six months later, in May of 2019, Dr. Alan Marlowe, a neurologist, looked across his office desk at Jane and her 2 adult children, Ted and Ellen. The mood in the room was tense and very emotional. Jane dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Only days ago, Jane's husband, Louis, had died. Dr. Marlowe first met Jane and Louis back in January of 2019, when she had brought her husband to the hospital following that seizure. Initially, Dr. Marlowe thought Louis must have a brain disorder, such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, or ALS. Any of these could have explained his abrupt mental decline and loss of motor control. And so Dr. Marlowe had conducted various tests to confirm that Lewis had one of these conditions, but all of the tests were inconclusive. Yet, week by week, Lewis's symptoms only worsened. He began having daydreams that were like nightmares. They were pure hallucinations, but very real to Lewis. Also, Lewis began to lose control of his limbs. He would have these muscle spasms that were super intense to the point where basic movements would cause him severe pain. Eventually, Dr. Marlowe suspected the worst: Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a rare and always fatal condition that is caused by abnormal proteins in the brain. The symptoms of CJD, as it's also called, can seem like an unusually fast-moving case of Alzheimer's, but there are no treatments to slow its progress. Victims typically die within 6 months to a year. Now, unfortunately, CJD can only be diagnosed by doing an autopsy of the patient's brain after death. And so even though Dr. Marlowe felt confident what Lewis had was CJD, he couldn't be sure so long as Lewis was alive. And so the doctor did everything in his power to ease Lewis's symptoms. However, his condition never improved, and Lewis died within 5 months of his first meeting with the doctor. Dr. Marlowe knew that being back in his office was hard for Jane, but he needed her to sign documents consenting to an autopsy of her husband's body. Learning the details of the condition that killed Lewis might help future CJD patients avoid a similar fate. Jane dried her eyes, took the pen, and signed the documents. Three months later, in the late summer of 2019, Dr. Marlowe returned to his office to find an email informing him that Lewis Benchley's post-mortem report was complete. Dr. Marlowe clicked it open, and he was surprised at what he saw. Lewis did not have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Lewis's symptoms had been very consistent with CJD. Nothing else had made sense to the doctor. But if CJD didn't kill Lewis, what did? Dr. Marlowe opened Lewis's old medical file to refamiliarize himself with the details. And as he did, something about Lewis's combination of symptoms rang a bell in Dr. Marlowe's memory. Dr. Marlowe dug up the case files of some other patients he treated over the past few years. Now, they were much younger than Lewis, in their 20s or 30s, so at first they did not seem connected to him, especially since CJD typically afflicted older or elderly people. But these younger patients had reported very similar symptoms to Lewis: sudden mental and physical decline with no warning or prior genetic condition. The other similarity was that nearly all the patients, Lewis included, lived in the same two regions of Canada: the city of Moncton, which is the most populous city in New Brunswick, and the Acadian Peninsula, a strip of the northeast coast known for scenic fishing villages and blueberry farms. However, Dr. Marlowe couldn't imagine why the people in these two specific areas of New Brunswick would be more vulnerable to this strange and deadly disease. Dr. Marlowe buzzed his secretary to schedule a meeting with Jane to share the results of her husband's examination. Dr. Marlowe wondered what to tell her after breaking the news that her husband had not in fact died of CJD. He knew she'd want to know the same thing he did. What had killed Lewis? Dr. Marlowe just hoped he could eventually find the answer. 6 months later, in the depths of winter, Dr. Marlowe poured himself another cup of coffee in the break room and looked out the window. It was barely 3 p.m., but it was already getting dark out. Dr. Marlowe felt spread thin by his workload recently. Over the past 6 months, his medical practice had been filled with a string of complicated cases, all very similar to Lewis Benchley's. Patient after patient had come to him after suffering an abrupt mental decline, followed by physical degeneration. As with Lewis, many of the patients exhibited symptoms similar to CJD, but something was always slightly off. No matter how many tests Dr. Marlowe ran, the results never quite aligned with CJD. The symptoms either developed too slowly or too rapidly, or they didn't respond to medications that they should have. But the strangest thing was how young most of these patients were. And this made Dr. Marlowe think. Ever since Lewis's post-mortem examination showed that he was negative for CJD, Dr. Marlowe had begun to have this sneaking suspicion. Maybe what happened to Lewis was something totally new, something other doctors hadn't recognized yet, something still unnamed. Dr. Marlowe admitted that was a bit far-fetched, but it was the only working theory Dr. Marlowe had. However, despite his suspicion that perhaps he was looking at this brand new condition here, Dr. Marlowe still reported each of these new mysterious cases to the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease surveillance system, run by the Canadian government. he hoped that by keeping the government informed, it would help them spot larger trends that maybe Dr. Marlowe couldn't. He figured that if they did see a bigger trend, that healthcare providers like himself would be notified of any special actions they should take in response. In the meantime, though, Dr. Marlowe decided to do a little investigating on his own. A little over a year later, on an early morning in 2021, Louis Benchley's son, Ted, opened his morning newspaper and saw that the mystery disease that had killed his father was finally getting some public attention. After meeting with Dr. Marlowe, Ted and his sister Ellen had been scared to death. They wondered if the disease might have some genetic basis, and whether as a result, they were at risk of meeting the same fate as their father. But since at this point nobody knew what the disease even was, there was no way to determine if they were in danger or not. That morning, Ted read that Dr. Marlowe, along with a variety of other experts, had been meeting at the Public Health Agency of Canada to discuss a new disease that had afflicted more than 40 people in the region, which meant Dr. Marlowe had discovered at least 20 new cases since Ted's dad got sick. These experts were referring to this disease by the name New Brunswick Neurological Syndrome of Unknown Etiology. Ted continued reading, and he saw that patients with the syndrome spanned different ages, lifestyles, and backgrounds, but they all seemed to develop dementia in the exact same way his father had. And so far, 6 of these people had died. Ted was relieved to read that the scientists did not see any genetic link in this disease. In fact, scientists found that these patients had only one thing in common. They all lived in the same geographical area. And this made scientists suspect that something in the environment might be to blame. Some scientists had apparently drafted a memo to warn local doctors about this horrible, mysterious illness, while others feared it would cause panic and argued against sending it out. However, that disagreement no longer mattered because somebody had leaked the whole memo to the press. And so the mysterious disease now had global attention. With this mystery disease now out in the open, Ted hoped to connect with other families affected by the syndrome, and he would quickly discover that somebody had already set up a discussion group for New Brunswick Neurological Syndrome on Facebook. And soon, Ted would share to this group that the Canadian Institutes of Health Research had offered Dr. Marlowe's group 5 million Canadian dollars to fund a clinical investigation of New Brunswick disease. However, 2 months later, the New Brunswick provincial government announced it would be taking over this investigation, which meant Dr. Marlowe and his team of scientists would no longer be involved. Ted and the other members of this Facebook group could not understand why the government would exclude Dr. Marlowe. He had done more than anybody else to identify the strange condition and its victims. Ted thought the government should be looking to include more scientists rather than leaving people out. It just made no sense to Ted or anybody else in this group, unless something was going on behind the scenes that they weren't aware of. 5 months later, in October of 2021, Ted was driving to work on a crisp fall morning. He kept the windows cracked to enjoy the fresh air, with the radio turned on low. Ted was doing his best to enjoy the morning, but his mind was preoccupied. His father, Louis, had been dead for over 2 years, but his cause of death was still unknown. Ted and his Facebook friends had been anxious for more information, but ever since the provincial government had taken over the investigation, there had been zero updates on the issue. As Ted passed an 18-wheeler loaded with lumber, his ear happened to catch a snippet from the radio. He turned up the volume just in time to hear the announcer mention the New Brunswick disease. The province had been studying a cluster of 48 cases, 8 of which had been fatal so far. To conduct autopsies on those 8 fatalities, they had turned to an independent doctor from the province of Ontario, Dr. Robert Hansen. And now Dr. Hansen had finished his investigation. And his preliminary conclusion was that there was no connection between the cases. They were all separate incidents, unrelated to each other. Dr. Hansen determined that each of these patients had contracted a well-known disease, such as cancer, Lewy body dementia, or Alzheimer's. There was no new disease here. Ted couldn't believe what he was hearing. He was certain there had to be a connection between all these cases. Also, Ted had seen his father's autopsy report. He wasn't sure which disease Dr. Hansen thought had killed his father, but he knew that his dad had absolutely not died of CJD or any of those diseases listed in Dr. Hansen's report. It was something new, something that still was not recognized by the medical community. And so now, Ted wondered if maybe the Canadian government wanted to keep it that way. Something just felt off about this whole situation, and so Ted decided he was going to do something about it. Over the next few months, Ted and his family communicated with dozens of families through that New Brunswick disease Facebook group, and they all agreed that Dr. Hansen was wrong. There was a connection between all these cases. And the cause had to be environmental since almost every patient lived in the same area of Canada. Working together, Ted and the others had come up with possible strategies to continue searching for an answer. One idea was just to crowdfund their own environmental testing. Another idea was to invite famed environmental activist Erin Brockovich, whose life was actually made into a movie starring Julia Roberts, to have her lead an outside investigation. And at the same time, week after week, they campaigned relentlessly, hoping that Dr. Hansen's panel might change their conclusion that the condition was not real. They hoped they were having an effect, but Ted couldn't tell for sure. Then one day, on February 24th of 2022, Ted picked up the newspaper from his front lawn and saw a headline about the case. He brought the paper inside and spread it out on the kitchen table and flipped to the article. And there it was, in print, the Provincial Oversight Committee's final report on the so-called New Brunswick disease. After supposedly much consideration and debate, the committee ruled in agreement with Dr. Hansen's assessment. The cases were not connected. A new disease did not exist. Ted's heart sank. All of their efforts had been for nothing. It seemed like the truth behind his father's death would now stay unknown forever. Over 8 months later, as the sun was beginning to set on an autumn afternoon in 2022, Dr. Marlowe slumped into his chair behind his desk and sighed deeply. His last patient of the day had just left. Finally, he could take a moment for himself. Even after the government shut down his research into the New Brunswick disease, Dr. Marlowe's workload of patients who appeared to have the non-existent condition continued to grow. Eventually, it totaled 430, 111 of whom were under the age of 45, and 39 had died so far. And almost all of them suffered a similar pattern of sudden cognitive and physical decline. Dr. Marlowe could find little connection between the age or background of the patients themselves, but he did notice a striking pattern in when they got sick. Most of his new cases were clustered around late summer and early fall. He tried to think about what environmental factors might change at the end of the summer. Glancing out the window, Dr. Marlowe let his eyes settle on the line of trees at the horizon, a common sight across heavily forested Canada. But today, it sparked something in his mind. Dr. Marlowe wondered if the late summer spike in cases had something to do with forestry schedules. Dr. Marlowe knew that most logging is done in the summer. Once the trees are felled and hauled away, new seedlings are planted to regrow the area, so it can be logged again in the future. But in order to keep weeds and shrubs from choking off the new trees, loggers spray herbicide. As with many chemicals, Dr. Marlowe knew that their effects on humans sometimes took generations to identify. If it was discovered that exposure to these herbicide chemicals was sickening people in this area, it would be a massive liability for the Canadian government. Was it possible that's what they were afraid of, and why the government had closed the investigation? To keep a connection like this hidden? Logging was one of New Brunswick's oldest, biggest, and most profitable industries, and messing with an economic engine of that size was a dangerous business. If the forestry industry feared they might be tied to a public health epidemic, Dr. Marlowe had no doubt that calls would be made to top political leaders to put pressure on them to stop that information from getting out. Too many people stood to lose too much money. Dr. Marlowe wanted to test this new chemical theory, but it would take weeks before he finally found a laboratory that was willing to discreetly run some tests for him. It was a 6-hour drive away in the province of Quebec, but Dr. Marlowe was thankful to have anyone willing to take on this work. In December of 2022, Dr. Marlowe collected blood samples from over 100 of his New Brunswick disease patients, and he shipped them to this laboratory. His goal was to test as wide a spectrum of patients as possible to make sure his results were scientifically sound. Weeks later, Dr. Marlowe finally got word from the lab that the tests were complete. He swiped open his tablet to check the results, and what he saw astonished him. Dr. Marlowe's hunch had been correct. The results from the Quebec laboratory proved it. 90% of Dr. Marlowe's patients' blood samples contained elevated levels of glyphosate, which is a herbicide routinely used in forestry work. In one case, the levels were 15,000 times higher than the lowest detectable numbers. The chemicals in glyphosate block an enzyme necessary for plant growth, so any weeds or grasses sprayed with it eventually die. Dr. Marlowe was certain that this chemical was having a long-term, sometimes devastating effect on people's health. But despite his findings, not everyone agrees that glyphosate can be harmful. The United States Environmental Protection Agency ruled in 2022 that glyphosate causes no health risk, even to children. But in Canada, the debate is beginning to tilt in Dr. Marlowe's favor. Eventually, the province of Quebec acknowledged a link between glyphosate and an increased risk for Parkinson's, a brain disorder that can cause stiffness and serious problems with movement. Other recent studies have shown that glyphosate disrupts the naturally occurring bacteria in the gut that play a key role in overall health. When bacteria in the gut are imbalanced, it can cause inflammation throughout the body, including in the brain. Some scientists believe this inflammation can lead to Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative disorders, just like Lewis and the other patients experienced. In July of 1924, Fred Beck, along with 4 other gold prospectors, stumbled out of a forest right near Mount St. Helens in Washington state. And they swore to each other that they would not tell a soul what they had seen in the mountains the night before. But literally within a few hours of making that promise to each other, one of the men had spilled the beans at a bar. Very quickly, their story would garner major national media attention and even drew some international attention as well. This is their story. So the week leading up to the men arriving back in town with this crazy story, they had been prospecting for gold in an area they were very accustomed to working in. In fact, for the past 6 years, they had been going to this spot. So it was an area they knew well. And so this particular week that they were out there had been really successful. They had found a whole bunch of gold. It was like this great run of luck and nobody wanted to leave. Unfortunately, one of the men named Fred Beck started complaining of a really bad toothache. Now, they're about 2 miles away from this town. It's very rugged terrain. It's not safe for someone to travel alone in case something were to happen. And so Fred needed one or all of these men to come back with him. None of them wanted to leave, but they were willing to compromise. And they said, let's stay here today, and then we'll leave first thing tomorrow morning. And so Fred didn't really have much of a choice, and so he agreed, and they spent the rest of the day prospecting for gold. When the sun started to go down, the men decided it was time to pack it in and head to their cabin. Now, because these men had worked in this area for the past 6 years, they had actually built a small log cabin centrally located in this area so they could just crash out there and continue to work and not need to commute out of the town. The cabin, though, was not built for comfort. It was built entirely for practicality. It was barely big enough to sleep all 5 men, and in fact, 2 of them had to sleep in the same bed, like right against one another, and then the other 3 had to sleep on the ground. There were no windows in this cabin. It was like this awful chamber that they were trapped inside of. But it was sturdy, it protected them from the elements, and it was enough because they were out there for work, not for pleasure. So as they're walking towards their tiny little cabin, they get just outside the cabin and notice a very large footprint, like an animal print, outside the cabin. The men stop, they look down. Now, these are 5 rugged mountain men that are accustomed to being out in the wild. They've had their fair share of run-ins with large predators, and so they quickly said, oh, that's a bear print. But upon closer inspection, as they're looking at this print, they noticed it was 19 inches long. That's way too big to be a bear print. And so they start speculating about what type of animal could make that print. As they're speculating, one of the men brings up that over the course of the week when he had been away from the group, a little ways away from the cabin, he had noticed a similar, not nearly as big, but a similar print. And when he had bent down to look at the print and inspect it to see what it was, he said he heard a whistling sound coming from the forest that was right next to him. And so he stood up and he looked, but he didn't see where the whistling was coming from. And he thought to himself, I don't know what animal makes that sound. So he's looking out, he can't see where the whistling's coming from, and then he hears whistling behind him. The same sound, but on the opposite side of him. And he turns around and he looks, and there's nothing over there as well. And he's trying to put together in his head what animal makes that sound. He knows it's not the people he's out there with because they were way over near the cabin and he could actually see them from where he was. And he starts getting this really uneasy feeling that whatever made this huge print is probably in the woods right now watching me, whistling at me. And so he abandons the print and heads back to camp, but was too embarrassed to bring the story up to the group in fear that they would think he was exaggerating, so he never brought it up. When this guy tells this story to the group, Fred Beck would say, "That's weird. I heard whistling coming from the forest too. I thought it was you guys." They figured they were dealing with a large predator. They decide that it's in their best interest to forego a campfire outside the cabin, which they normally would do at night, and instead just go right inside the cabin and shut the door because they don't know what animals are out here and they want to play it safe. So they're sitting inside their windowless little dark cabin and they start feeling pretty hungry. And they decide they want to boil some water to make food, but they don't have any water. Normally, when any of these guys went out to fetch water, they would go by themselves. The spring was not very far away from their cabin. They just walk out, scoop some water up, and come back. But because they were all feeling pretty uneasy and they didn't know what this big animal was that was in their general vicinity, Fred, along with one of the other men whose name was Hank, decide to go together and to bring their rifles just in case. Fred and Hank begin walking over to the stream that was only about 100 meters away from where they were. The moon was out, so there was a little bit of light coming from that, but it was mostly dark. And they're walking over to this stream. Then all of a sudden, Hank stops and raises his rifle up at the side of this embankment that was totally forested all the way up the side of the valley. Fred looks where Hank is aiming, and immediately he can tell what he's looking at. Standing a couple hundred meters up this mountain is this creature that's very tall, standing on two legs. It appears to be hairy, that's poking its head around a tree and it's looking at them. They could only see it because the moon was casting light directly on it, so it was totally illuminated. As soon as Fred recognizes what they're looking at, the creature ducks back behind the tree. At the same time, Hank fires 3 shots in its general direction, and then there's silence. And then all of a sudden it comes barreling out from behind the tree and is running straight down the mountain towards them while whistling over its shoulder, looking like it's communicating with something behind it. Hank starts firing in its direction. It's clearly not striking this creature, but at some point the creature disappears. They don't know where it went. It's dark out. The only way they could see it before was because the moonlight happened to illuminate it. Now they don't know where it is. Fred and Hank abandon the water idea and they run right back to the cabin. They jump inside, shut the door, and they start barricading the door shut. The other men are like, "What the heck is going on?" And they start explaining what happened. They didn't know if it was a person or if it was this creature. They heard that whistling sound. All the guys are spooked. And now they're barricaded inside of this tiny cabin and it's totally dark. There's no windows, so they can't even see what's going on outside of the cabin. And so they just had to sit there and hope that this creature does not come anywhere near them. After a long period of total silence, the men start to feel like, okay, whatever that was, it's not coming back. It's late at night. Let's just try to get some sleep. And so the men all lay down and eventually doze off to sleep. Then at some point in the middle of the night, something smashes into the side of the cabin, causing them all to wake up. Hank's yelling out because a piece of wood that actually made up the cabin had come loose from whatever had hit the side of the cabin and fallen onto him. So the group gets up. There's a little bit of light coming through this now, a little crack in the wall from where this wood plank came out. They can see what's happening now. There's a little bit of light inside. They run over, they get this plank off of Hank, and as they're trying to kind of make sense of this chaotic moment, they start hearing what sounds like lots of people running around the outside of their cabin. Hank, who was closest to this little slat that had been created from one of the planks falling out, just turns his head to look out the slat. Because of the moon, there was a little bit of illumination, and when he looked out, he was horrified because he saw 3 creatures, these tall, ape-like creatures, the same one that Fred and Hank had been shooting at up over at the valley before. They're standing 10-15 meters away from the cabin, standing upright, looking at the cabin. They're holding these small boulders in their hands. And as Hank is looking through the slat, he's trying to get a little bit closer to get a better look. one of the creatures bends down and sees that Hank is looking at him, and he winds up and he throws the boulder and it smashes against this little slat. Hank basically falls over because he's trying to avoid this boulder being thrown at him, but the slat was small enough that it didn't go through. Hank's telling the rest of the men that there's three of them. There's three of them. They're right there. The men are grabbing their rifles. They're getting ready to aim out of the slat to try to take a shot at one of these creatures. But by the time they have a sight picture, there's no one out there, except they hear these footsteps and they start hearing whistling coming from the other sides of the cabin, where they have no way of seeing what's going on because there's no windows and that gap in the cabin was only facing one way. And so they just sit there in silence as they hear all this whistling and footsteps and shuffling happening outside of their cabin. Then all of a sudden they hear slamming against the one door that leads into the cabin. They had barricaded the door already, so they go up and they're pressing back against the barricade as whatever is outside is trying to break into the cabin, but it can't get through the barricade. When they couldn't break in the front door, there was a barrage of these boulders smashing into the cabin. Now, these men had built the cabin. They knew it was sturdy, but they didn't know if it could withstand boulders hitting it. And so for hours, these rocks and boulders are smashing into the cabin. They never see them again through that slat. They kept periodically looking and there was never any creatures that were on that side. It was like the creatures knew that they could be seen on that side but couldn't be seen elsewhere. Finally, it just stops and they sit down in the middle of the cabin. Fred was sitting in such a way that he could actually see the slat in the cabin that was now open and exposed. And as he's sitting there, Fred is horrified when he sees a hand slide into the cabin. A hairy, big ape hand that reaches in and starts fumbling around, grabs hold of an axe that was leaning up against the inside of the cabin. And as it's getting ready to pull it out, Fred runs over and twists the axe so it won't slide through the slat. And so the creature's slamming the axe, trying to get it out at the same time that Hank takes a shot and shoots right through the slat. The creature releases it and runs away. They hear all this whistling very close to their cabin, which made them realize that they had just been quietly waiting outside of their cabin. They had never left. But after Hank had taken that shot at the thing's hand, it sounded like almost a stampede was running away off into the forest. And at that point, the group was fairly certain that it was done. The next morning, when they saw through that slat in their cabin that the sun had finally come up, the men packed only the bare necessities. They got their weapons. When they finally opened up that door, all over the ground, all around the cabin were these rocks that clearly had been thrown at the cabin. The cabin itself had obviously withstood the barrage, but there was gash marks and slashes all over it. Feeling very lucky, the men start making their way out of the valley and they make their way all the way back to town. And after the story kind of went viral, loads of people went out there to try to find these creatures, but no one ever could. In December of 1981, Mike Woolley decided he wanted to go deer hunting in his hometown in Louisiana. It was a cold day, it was great conditions for a hunt, and Mike had a deer stand that was set up about 1.5 miles down this old logging road that no one really used. He would take his truck and he would drive about halfway down that road, and then he'd get out and he would walk the remaining, half mile, 3/4 of a mile to his deer stand, because if he drove his truck in, he would scare away all the deer. He made it to his deer stand by about 3 p.m. that day, and he'd only been there for about 30 minutes when all of a sudden this young doe comes running across and stops right in front of his deer stand. The doe lays down and is clearly exhausted, and Mike would say that it looked like something was chasing it, and he assumed it was some huge buck. And so Mike's getting ready for this big buck to emerge when out of the corner of his eye, he sees something pretty big jump out of a tree. And he kind of turns his head and looks, and it's not a buck. It looked like a gorilla. He thought, okay, a gorilla must have gotten out of the zoo. But then he's thinking to himself, there isn't a zoo around here, and there's no circus around here, so it can't be an escaped gorilla. And then he was like, okay, someone must have put on a gorilla suit to stop me from deer hunting. They're out here to try to get me to leave this spot. They're anti-deer hunting, and so they're here to screw with me. And so Mike, believing that was the case, he starts yelling to them, take off your mask. This isn't okay. This isn't funny. I have a license to be here. You can't be here. You need to leave. Get out of here. And so this thing that he believes is a person wearing a gorilla suit just completely does not react. It's just standing looking at him. And it's about 15 or 20 meters away from him at this time, and it's just staring at him. It's on 2 legs. Mike starts to feel uneasy because he's thinking to himself, if this is somebody in a gorilla suit that's trying to get me to leave, wouldn't they right now announce that and say, you need to leave? They wouldn't just stand there doing nothing. And so Mike, even though he knew it was going to probably escalate the situation, raises up his rifle in the direction of this person to use his scope, to basically zoom in on this person and get a better look. And when he raises his rifle and he zooms in, he immediately knows that this is not a person wearing a mask. Steam was coming off of its face like it had been running. I mean, it was 30 degrees outside. And he said he could see its nostrils flaring like it was out of breath, or that perhaps it was angry. He didn't know. Even though it wasn't a person wearing a mask, it looked very human-like because it had human teeth, flat teeth. It had, he said, human eyelashes. And just the general structure of its face appeared to be human. And he thought to himself, is this a feral human? Is that possible? Is this a person that has been born and raised in the wild? And so as he's pointing the weapon at this creature, looking through the scope, just totally dumbfounded. Mike has no intention of shooting at this point. He really just wanted to stare at it. The creature roars, and Mike describes it as like a lion's roar. This thing was suddenly really upset with Mike. And Mike believed later on that it was because he raised his weapon at this thing. As soon as it roars, Mike said that about 100 meters in the other direction, he hears this really loud, piercing whistle coming through the forest. As soon as that whistle comes through the forest, the creature that was still growling stops and turns its head in the direction of this whistle. And it whistles back. And so Mike, I mean, the hair on the back of his neck is standing up. He knows they're communicating, probably about him. And as he's realizing this, he lowers his weapon and he's looking at the creature in front of him who's whistling and looking in the direction of this way. And then that creature snaps back and looks right at Mike. And as he's wondering what he should do next, another creature walks out of the tree line and stands right next to the first creature. And the way it walked, it was walking like a human. It was on two legs. And they're both standing about 20 meters away looking directly at Mike. Mike is terrified. And he would say that he knew that he had to make a run for it. And so he leaps from his stand and starts running towards his truck, which is about a half mile away. And he said as soon as he did, he could tell that one of them at least started sprinting after him. And he looked over his shoulder as he's running towards the logging road, and he sees that one of the creatures is running parallel to him, easily running as fast as he is. It's choosing to stay, 5-10 meters away from him, but running in step with him the whole way. It's like it's forcing him to leave the forest. And so Mike is running, waiting to get attacked by this creature. He finally gets to his truck, he clambers inside and shuts the doors, and he looks out of his window and he sees the creature just standing there looking at him from the trees. He looks in his rear view and he sees that the other creature had also been running after him on the logging road, that the two of them had basically herded him to his car. It was an intelligent move. Mike believes that because he raised his weapon at that first creature, that triggered a series of events that led to them chasing him out of the woods. He said that he was the aggressor, not the other way around. We don't know if either of those stories are true, but certainly they are terrifying. So I'd love to get your reaction to these two stories in the comments. Are these total fabrications, or is there some truth to Bigfoot, and these stories are just evidence of that? If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to steal the like button's phone and turn off all their alarms so they're late for work tomorrow. Also, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you have a story suggestion... In 1998, the Barber family was living a charmed life. Michael and Elizabeth had been happily married for 20 years, and they had 3 beautiful daughters who ranged in age from 9 to 15, and they were all thriving. The family lived in a very modest, plain-looking home in Melbourne, Australia, but the second you stepped foot inside of that home, you would see it was bursting with life. The sounds of kids laughing and playing, and of Michael and Elizabeth happily chatting away filled every room. Now, the Barbers' lives were not perfect by any means. In fact, they struggled financially and lived basically paycheck to paycheck. However, they didn't let their financial struggles define them. Instead, Michael and Elizabeth put a lot of stock in another aspect of their lives that they were all undeniably rich in, and that was in creativity. Michael was a toy maker and a designer, and Elizabeth worked in children's literature. And each of the 3 Barber children were beginning to cultivate their own unique creative gifts. At 9 years old, Heather, who was the youngest, had developed a lovely singing voice. Ashley Rose, who was the middle child at 11 years old, had learned to play the flute. But the Barber's oldest daughter, 15-year-old Rachel, was really the star of the family. In fact, they called her that, Rachel Star. Rachel was an extremely talented dancer. She was so graceful and stylish that even when she was just walking around, it almost looked like she was dancing. Rachel was also very beautiful, with big emerald green eyes and fair skin, and she had this effortless charisma that just drew people to her. From the outside, Rachel really did look like the kid who had everything going for her. But, like the rest of us, Rachel had her own struggles. Like she was not a natural student. No matter how hard she tried, math and science just seemed impossible to her. And Rachel had a number of acute fears that really made certain aspects of her life very challenging. She was deathly afraid of the dark, she was afraid of talking to strangers, she was afraid of navigating the public transportation system on her own, and even just the thought of going into a store by herself filled her with immense dread. As a result of having these fears, Rachel was actually very dependent on her parents. Her mother, Elizabeth, would jokingly say that Rachel was 15, going on 18, going on 12. Eventually, when Rachel's anxieties and fears, combined with her struggles with traditional schoolwork, put her into a bit of a depression, her parents decided they needed to step in and take action. They wanted their Rachel star to be happy. They wanted to encourage her and nurture her strengths. And the thing that they knew she loved the most and was the best at was dance. So in September of 1998, Michael and Elizabeth allowed Rachel to drop out of her traditional school and transfer to a full-time dance school in Richmond, which was an inner-city suburb of Melbourne, located about 20 minutes away from the barber's house. And once Rachel was enrolled in this new dance school, she blossomed. She made loads of new friends, she started modeling, which was something she was very proud of, and she met a boy, Manny, who she absolutely adored. But as well as things seemed to be going for Rachel at her new school, she would soon make a fateful decision that would have absolutely catastrophic effects. On Monday, March 1st of 1999, so 5 months after Rachel had transferred to this new dance school, Rachel and her father, Michael, like every other morning, left the Barber household, climbed into Michael's car, and began driving to Wattle Park, which was a train station closest to their house. From Wattle Park, Rachel would catch a train that would take her to the Richmond station, and then she would get off, she would meet up with a friend, they would have breakfast, and they would walk the rest of the way to their dance school. When Michael pulled into the parking lot at Wattle Park and parked the car, and Rachel was getting her stuff to climb out of the vehicle to head up to the train, he stopped his daughter and said, "Hey, remember, I'll be back here at 6:15 tonight to pick you up." And Rachel looked at him, she smiled and said, "Okay," and then she hopped out of the car and she pranced her way over to the station. Michael watched his daughter just long enough to see her climb the steps and disappear, at which point he put his car back in drive, he left the lot, and he headed back home. That evening, Michael returned to Wattle Park. But at 6:15 p.m., when the train came rolling into the station, Rachel was not on board. Michael assumed his daughter must have been running late and so missed the train she would always take, and so he just sat in the parking lot and waited for the next train to come into the station. And a few minutes later, when it pulled into the station, Rachel was not on that train either. And so Michael, he was starting to get worried because he's looking outside, it's getting dark, he knows his daughter hates being out in the dark, she's afraid of being alone, and he's wondering, what's going on with her, but he keeps telling himself that she's bound to show up any minute. And so Michael just sat in this parking lot and watched train after train after train come through the station, and Rachel wasn't on any of them. Now, Michael didn't have a cell phone, and neither did Rachel, so he couldn't just call her to see where she was. But finally, after a few more trains came through and none of them contained his daughter, he left the parking lot but went to his parents' house, which was much closer than his own home, and he rushed inside and he grabbed their phone and he called back to his home, and when his wife, Elizabeth, Rachel's mom, picked up the phone, he immediately asked her, "Hey, is Rachel home? Did she get a ride home from one of her friends?" And Elizabeth would tell Michael, "No, she's not here, and she hasn't called." This was the moment when Michael and Elizabeth instinctively knew something had to be wrong. Rachel was on time for everything, and if she was late, she would always call ahead or call afterwards and at least give some explanation, but to just go silent and not show up, that was not in character. And again, because it was pitch black outside and they knew she was probably alone, that was a situation they knew Rachel would never want to be in because it would have terrified her. And so Michael tells Elizabeth he's going to come home as fast as he can. They hang up, and then while Elizabeth is waiting for her husband to return, she picked the phone right back up and she dialed Manny's number. That's Rachel's boyfriend. She figured maybe Rachel was with Manny, or at the very least, maybe she checked in with Manny, because most nights Rachel and Manny spoke on the phone. But when Manny picked up the phone, he would tell Elizabeth that he hasn't seen Rachel since earlier in the day, and she has not called him, which to him was odd. When Elizabeth asked Manny, what was my daughter doing when you were with her last? Manny would say, oh, we went out to a shopping mall near the school in Richmond, and we went to the shoe store, and Rachel actually walked up to a very particular set of shoes. They were these big platform blue chunky shoes, and she said that she was going to buy them the next day, and she was really excited about it. And Elizabeth, as she's hearing this, she knew exactly the shoes that Manny was describing, because just the day before, Rachel had taken her mom, Elizabeth, to the shoe store and pleaded with her to get those blue chunky platform shoes. But when Elizabeth had looked at the price tag, they were $100, and so they were too expensive. And so as Elizabeth is hearing Manny say that her daughter is talking about how she's going to buy these shoes the next day, Elizabeth is thinking, with what money? Rachel has no money. How could she possibly afford those shoes? And so she asked Manny, did Rachel say how she planned on affording those blue shoes? And Manny would say, actually, yeah. She told me that she had this secret job, but she wouldn't give me any more details about it. And she said that with the money from this secret job, she'd be able to buy these shoes. Manny would tell Elizabeth that Rachel really stressed that this secret job was nothing to worry about. It was nothing immoral. But as Elizabeth is listening to Manny tell her this, all her alarm bells are going off. She could not fathom any job that would require a 15-year-old girl to go out by herself at night doing something that was secret and give absolutely no information to her family. Every possibility just seemed bad. After hanging up the phone with Manny, Elizabeth began frantically calling all of Rachel's friends and acquaintances and different locations around town that she knew her daughter would frequent, but nobody had any information about where Rachel was. A little while later, Michael finally pulled into the driveway, and when he went inside, he talked to his wife briefly, but he could tell they had no new information. Their daughter was still not home. This was becoming a crisis. And so very quickly, Michael just left the house, got right back into his car, and he drove to the police station. But when he got to the police station, the police didn't really offer the response that he was hoping for. From the police's perspective, it sounded like a teenage girl has been missing for a few hours, and so in their mind, they're thinking, one, that's not an emergency yet, and two, she probably just kind of ran off. Teenagers do that, they come back the next day, it's normal. And so despite Michael's pleas to the police that no, this is different, my daughter would never do that, she would never run away, this is totally out of character, despite all those pleas, the police said, look, Michael, just go home, wait, your daughter will be home soon, and if for some reason in the next few days she does not come back home, you come back and you tell us. And so Michael, now feeling totally devastated and terrified for his daughter's safety, finally did just leave the police station and he headed back home. And then he and his wife and his two other daughters had a terrible, restless night's sleep, wondering what was going on with Rachel. And then finally, when the sun came up the next morning, Michael and Elizabeth rushed out of their bedroom and headed into the kitchen, hoping, praying that Rachel would just magically be in their house again. But when they went into the kitchen, Rachel wasn't there. She had not come home. However, pretty early on this second day of Rachel's disappearance, Michael and Elizabeth would learn something new. Manny would get in touch with Michael and Elizabeth, and he would tell them that he remembered something Rachel had said during their final conversation the day before. She had told Manny that he had nothing to worry about with regards to this secret job because it wasn't immoral, it was totally safe, and, Manny said, Rachel said there was an old female friend who was going to be there at this job site in some way participating that would keep her safe. And so Michael and Elizabeth have no idea what to make of this old female friend, but in a way it was kind of a relief because they know their daughter is basically terrified to be alone. And so at least knowing wherever she was with this old friend, that made them feel good. But the parents' positivity about this new development quickly faded when they began calling around to all of Rachel's friends, both new and old, female and otherwise, and none of them were missing. Everybody was where they were supposed to be, and nobody knew anything about what happened to Rachel. The only intel the parents got from this round of calling all of her friends was that several of her friends said that the day before, the day Rachel disappeared, they had walked with Rachel Rachel back to the train station after school. And in fact, one of the friends told Michael and Elizabeth that they offered Rachel a ride home so that she wouldn't have to ride the train back home, but Rachel had turned it down, saying her father was going to be meeting her on the other end at Wattle Park at 6:15 p.m. The Barbers didn't know what to make of this. Did Rachel believe at the time that she could go do this secret job and still be back in time to meet her father at 6:15 at Wattle Park? Or did she lie to the friend who was offering the ride and make up the story that she planned on seeing her father, when in reality she planned on ditching her father and going and doing this secret job for the night? But regardless of which of these things were true, the parents just still could not understand why by now, 24 hours later, their daughter still had not called to check in. Michael and Elizabeth found themselves wondering if they really knew their Rachel Starr as well as they thought they did. Maybe she had actually run away like the police suggested. The parents were totally distraught, they were totally anxious and terrified, and so with nothing else to do, over the next several days, they just continued to go out and look everywhere and talk to everyone to try to find where their daughter was. But everything they looked into turned into a dead end. Then, finally, on Monday, March 8th, so exactly 1 week since Rachel had disappeared, Michael and Elizabeth got a new lead. A girl named Allison, who had gone to a dance class with Rachel before Rachel had transferred schools, had overheard her younger sister talking about the Rachel Barber disappearance and how nobody had seen or heard from Rachel since 5:45 p.m. the previous Monday. Allison, who had not heard about Rachel's disappearance until this very moment, knew immediately she had to go forward and talk to police because she actually saw Rachel on the night she disappeared, a full hour after her last known sighting. At 6:40 p.m. on the night Rachel disappeared, Allison was on the train car headed to Praran, which is a suburb located southeast of where Rachel lived. And when this train that Allison was on pulled into the Richmond station and the doors opened up, Allison watched as Rachel, along with this other girl who Allison didn't recognize, walked on board and then took seats right next to each other on the other end of the train away from Allison. Now, from Allison's perspective, immediately it was clear they were friends. They were laughing and joking together and just kind of in their own world. And so Allison didn't want to be rude, so she stopped staring at them, and they continued riding the train until they got to the Praran station, at which point Allison got up to leave the train. But as she did, she saw Rachel and this mystery girl. They also had stood up, and they were making their way out of the door. And as they were leaving, Rachel actually would look up and see Allison, and they would both smile and wave at each other. But that was it. And then Allison would watch as Rachel and her friend would leave ahead of her, and they would walk down the platform. And from Allison's perspective, it seemed obvious that Rachel and this girl were friends, and whatever they were going to go do, they were choosing to go do, and they were going to do together. When Michael and Elizabeth heard about this sighting of their daughter on the train and this mystery girl, on the one hand, it was kind of reassuring because it meant that Rachel was with this friend, potentially the old female friend that Rachel mentioned to Manny, and so whatever she was doing, at least she was not alone. But on the other hand, it begged the question of what role did this mystery person play in wherever Rachel was now? Had Rachel and this mystery girl gone to do this secret job together and then something happened to them? Or had this mystery girl been Rachel's accomplice, and they had run off together like the police thought? Whatever the case was, the Barbers and the police at this point, who were looking much more seriously into the Barber case by now, they knew the next step was identifying this mystery girl. A couple of days later, on Thursday, March 11th, the police called in an artist to create a sketch of this mystery girl that Allison had seen on the train. Allison would describe this mystery girl as being older than Rachel, being heavier than Rachel, and very plain. That day, the police also ordered a trace on all of the phone calls going into the Barber residence on the day before she went missing, because they figured that if Rachel and this mystery girl were in cahoots on some sort of secret thing together, they likely communicated the day before. And when the phone call trace came back, there was one phone number in particular that stood out to police. There was a private phone number that called the Barber household twice on the day before Rachel disappeared. Once at 5:24 p.m., and that call lasted about 15 minutes, and then shortly after that call ended, the private number called back, and then there was another conversation that lasted about 30 minutes. It would take police another 24 hours, but eventually they would figure out who this private caller was. It was a 20-year-old woman named Caroline Robertson who very closely resembled the police sketch of the mystery girl that Allison had seen on the train, and it just so happened that Caroline Robertson lived very close to the Praron train station where Allison saw the mystery girl and Rachel get off. Additionally, Caroline was Rachel's old babysitter and was very close with the Barber family, and so it seemed very likely that Caroline was both the mystery girl on the train and the old female friend that Rachel had mentioned to Manny when she told him about this secret job. This new information was a huge relief. From Michael and Elizabeth's perspective and the police's perspective, it now seemed very likely that Rachel and Caroline had just snuck off together and were now probably hiding out at Caroline's apartment near the Praron train station. And so, believing they could put an end to this missing teenager drama that night, the police hopped in their cars and they drove over to Caroline's apartment. But when they got there at 5:25 p.m., they very quickly realized that things were not as they seemed. Police walked up to Caroline's front door and they knocked and began yelling out for Caroline and Rachel to come outside, but nobody yelled back and nobody opened the door. When they tried the handle, they found it was locked, so they got in touch with the property's real estate agent, who came out and gave them a set of spare keys, and when the police tried those keys, they found they still could not open the door because the door had been locked from the inside with a special latch. And so the police began walking around the perimeter of the building looking for another way inside. And as they're walking, one of the officers looks up and sees a second-floor window of the apartment is open, and it's open enough that clearly a person could slip inside. And so the police contacted the fire department, who showed up very quickly, and they put a ladder up against the side of the apartment that went up to that open window, and then a police officer began climbing up. And when he got up to the window and could look inside, he saw he was looking into a bedroom. And at first, it looked totally ordinary until he noticed there was a body lying face down at the foot of the bed on the ground. It was Caroline. The officer on the ladder immediately turned around and yelled for backup, and then he and other officers poured into the apartment, and before long, Caroline, who did actually still have a pulse, but she was totally unconscious and not responding, she was being rushed to the hospital. And while that was happening, the remainder of the officers who were on site, they all went into the apartment to try to find Rachel. And so as they're searching this apartment, which was totally messy, there was things everywhere, there were boxes everywhere, it almost looked like Carolyn had been packing her apartment to move, potentially, when something happened to her, causing her to fall unconscious inside of her bedroom. And so the police searched this apartment top to bottom, and they did not find Rachel. In fact, there was no trace of Rachel anywhere, except they did find a bag of clothes that looked like they were Rachel's size, not Caroline's size, but it wasn't clear if those were actually Rachel's clothes. And so the police just kind of walked around the apartment, gathering up anything that seemed suspicious, like they found rubber gloves and hair dye, they found some bank receipts and some notebooks with some strange writing in them, and they just hoped that some of this stuff might lead to Rachel. Back at the hospital, Caroline had regained consciousness, and even though she was very disoriented and seemed kind of out of it, the medical staff allowed the police to come in right away and start asking questions because they knew time was of the essence with Rachel. They had to find her. And so the officers came into Caroline's room, and they sat down, and the first question they asked her was, "Do you know where Rachel Barber is?" And Caroline just stood there kind of stunned for a second, and then just said, "Yes." Over the next few months, as Caroline's memory came back into focus, she would piece together one of the most unbelievable stories that police in Melbourne had ever heard. The following is a reconstruction of that story based both on Caroline's testimony and on what police were able to actually fact-check. Back on Sunday, February 28th, 1999, so the day before Rachel vanished, Caroline called Rachel and offered her a job. Caroline told Rachel that she was working on this psychology study and she needed participants. However, the study was highly confidential, so if Rachel did want to be a part of it, she wouldn't be able to tell anyone what she was doing. However, the study was quite lucrative for Rachel, and it really didn't require much of Rachel. All Rachel had to do was meet Caroline the following day after school was over at the Richmond train station, and then the two of them would ride the train to Praran. They would get off, make their way to Caroline's apartment, and there they would conduct this psychological study, and when it was over, Caroline would pay Rachel $100 and the cost of transportation. And so Rachel, she was thrilled at the idea because she wanted those beautiful blue shoes, and so she said yes. So the next day, Monday, March 1st, Rachel wrapped up school. She made her way to the Richmond train station. She connected with Caroline. They hopped on board the train. They made their way to Praran with Allison spotting them on the train as they went. And then when they got off the train at Praran, Caroline and Rachel would make their way to a nearby pizza shop and get a pizza and some beer. And then they would walk the rest of the way to Caroline's apartment. Once they were inside the apartment, Caroline led them upstairs to her bedroom. And then they both sat down on the floor at the foot of the bed and began eating their pizza and having some beer and just laughing and exchanging some stories. And then after their dinner was over, Caroline told Rachel it was time to start the study, and it began with a guided meditation. Sitting next to Rachel, Caroline told her to stay calm, think happy thoughts, close your eyes, and just begin to breathe in nice and slow, breathe out nice and slow, and just feel yourself breathing in and out. And so Rachel did as she was told and began breathing in and out and being very calm. And Caroline, at this point, she stood up and began kind of pacing around the room, watching Rachel periodically and reminding her to think happy thoughts and stay calm and keep just listening to herself breathe in and breathe out. And then at some point, Caroline just stopped and stood right in front of Rachel and just stared at her really intently. And at some point, Caroline was confident that the drugs she had laced in the pizza that she had given Rachel were starting to take an effect. It looked like Rachel was starting to doze off. And so at that point, Caroline walked around behind Rachel, who still had her eyes closed. She's still doing the study, and Caroline pulled out a telephone cord. She wrapped it around Rachel's neck, and she pulled it as tight as she could. Immediately, Rachel came out of her trance, and she reached up and began trying to pull the cord off of her neck. But Caroline was easily 50 pounds heavier than Rachel, and easily was able to maintain control over Rachel. And so Rachel is squirming and fighting and scratching and doing everything she can to try to get this cord off, but she can't. And eventually the fight just leaves her body and she goes still. Caroline would maintain tension on that cord to ensure Rachel was dead, but then eventually she would release the tension on the cord, at which point she would drag Rachel's body into a nearby closet and she would shut the door. 2 days later, Caroline would open that closet up and she would drag Rachel's body back out of the closet with the cord still wrapped around her neck, and she would roll Rachel's body up in a carpet and then stuff her inside of a large army duffel bag that Caroline had purchased for this exact reason, for disposing Rachel's body. And then she called a taxi who came to her apartment, and she lugged Rachel's body still inside of this bag and dumped it in the taxi. And then she and Rachel's body and the taxi driver drove about an hour north to rural Kilmore, where Caroline's father had a vacation home. And there she would bury Rachel's body in a shallow grave next to one of her childhood pets. When Caroline had been rushed to the hospital because she was found unconscious in her bedroom by police, the assumption was she and probably Rachel had been attacked, and that was why Caroline was unconscious. But what really happened is Caroline was in her apartment and she saw the police show up, and it made her so stressed that it triggered a seizure, and that was why she passed out in her bedroom. When she came to in the hospital and people began asking her what happened, she would say that Rachel's death was an accident. However, months later, after investigators had gone through all of the evidence they had collected from Caroline's apartment, they discovered Rachel's death was anything but accidental. According to the notebooks they found all over Caroline's apartment, which were basically Caroline's journals, Caroline hated herself. She totally loathed her physical image and who she was, and she was obsessed with the girl she used to babysit, Rachel Barber. Rachel was this beautiful, perfect person that Caroline wished she could be. And so one day, Caroline decided she would just stop being Caroline and would literally become Rachel. And to do that, she would kill Rachel and assume her identity. The secret job, the psychology study that Caroline offered Rachel, was a very intentional trap. She knew Rachel wanted money for things like those blue shoes, and she knew Rachel would trust Caroline. Caroline was her babysitter, and so Rachel would have no problem going into Caroline's apartment alone at night to get the money. Caroline planned to murder Rachel and stage it so it looked like Rachel had run away, and then afterwards, Caroline planned to lose 45 pounds and then get a nose job so she would look more like Rachel. And then to complete her transformation, Caroline would legally change her name to Rachel Barber. In November of 2000, Caroline Robertson pleaded guilty to murdering Rachel Barber and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. In January of 2015, Caroline was released after only serving 15 of those 20 years. In the years after Rachel's death, Rachel's mother, Elizabeth, would write a book about the experience called The Perfect Victim, which would later be adapted into a major movie that starred some of Australia's biggest actors and actresses. On Wednesday, March 24th, 1999, Rachel Barber's body was once again lowered into the ground, except this time she was surrounded by friends and family and people who loved her. Over 850 people attended Rachel's funeral. They brought letters and poems and toys, which were all buried with Rachel, as were the blue shoes that Rachel so wanted that she planned to buy with the $100 Caroline had promised her. A young woman named Jen was sitting in her sister's living room, looking out their back window where her son and her two nephews were playing. And as she's watching them, one of her nephews, named Harrison, walked over to this tree and began peeling the bark off of the tree. And for Jen, this brought back a very strange childhood memory that she hadn't thought about in decades. And without meaning to actually say the words out loud, Jen kind of blurted out what was going through her head, which was, "So weird." And her mother, who was in the other room, heard her say that, and she yells into the room, "Hey Jen, is everything okay? What's so weird?" And Jen, feeling a little bit embarrassed that she just said that out loud and that her mom heard her, is quick to try to dismiss it by saying, "Oh no, sorry, it's nothing. I didn't mean to say that." But as she's trying to dismiss it, her mom had walked into the living room where Jen was and saw Jen was looking out the back window towards the boys. And so her mom walked right up next to Jen and goes, "What are the boys doing out there that's so weird? Are they doing something they shouldn't be doing?" And Jen's like, no, it has nothing to do with the kids. I just saw Harrison, who was doing something that reminded me of some weird thing that happened to me, and I blurted out my reaction to it. That's all. And Jen's mom looks at her and says, "Well, now you got to tell me the memory because I'm totally intrigued." Jen says, "Okay, Mom, I'll tell you the story. I don't know if Frankie's mom ever told you this or not, but when I was 8 years old, I spoke to Frankie and he was doing some homework and he told me to come meet him outside of his house and that when he was done, we could meet up and go play together." And so I walked over to his house and I was standing across the street in front of that small group of trees that we called the Pine Cone Forest, even though it was just a handful of trees, but we all called it that. Anyways, I was standing over there and I was just kind of mindlessly peeling the bark off of the tree. I don't even remember consciously deciding to do it. And so as I'm peeling the bark off the tree, watching Frankie's house, waiting for him to come outside, I noticed to my right, there's this guy walking through the forest towards me. And I look at him and I've never seen him before. And before he got even within 10 feet of me, I could smell cigarettes. He reeked of cigarettes and his teeth were very yellow. He's missing a number of teeth. And I noticed right away when I looked at his hands, I don't know why I was looking at his hands, but I looked at his hands and he had these pointy yellow fingernails that almost looked like he was intentionally growing them out to be long and jagged. And he comes walking up to me and stops completely in my personal space. And instead of looking at me, he looks at the spot on the tree where I had been peeling the bark off. And he's literally like 1 foot away from me, so close that I had to lean back because I didn't want to be rude and run away. So I'm leaning back to avoid being right next to this guy. And all I can smell is cigarette smoke. And he turns from the tree to me and he goes, "What do you think you're doing?" And I'm like this, and I'm like, "I'm waiting for my friend." And he says, "No, what are you doing to the tree?" And I remember looking at him and then the tree and saying, "Peeling the bark off?" And that's when he raised his hand up and pinched my arm with his nails, not with the pads of his fingers, but he was using his nails and he's pinching down on my skin, and through gritted teeth, he says, "How would you like it if someone peeled your skin off?" I remember as he's pinching me, I was so terrified that I didn't do anything. I was like in a trance and just stood there looking at him, wondering what's about to happen. And then as luck would have it, Frankie's mom just happened to come outside and yelled, "Hey, come on inside, Frankie's done with his homework." And so that kind of broke me out of my trance. I pulled my arm away and I began running away from him across the street towards Frankie's house. And I turned around once, kind of expecting him to be chasing me, but he wasn't. He was still standing next to the tree that I had pulled the bark off of, except now he was watching me. And I ran up onto the porch and ran inside, and that was that. I remember wanting to tell you about it when I got home, but for some reason I didn't. And then days turned into weeks, turned into months, and before long, it was just a distant memory, and I never really thought about it, and at some point did forget about it, until just now, when I saw Harrison peeling the bark off of the tree, and it brought it back, and that's why you heard me say, so weird. That was my reaction to it, because I'm wondering, who was that guy and what happened to him? Like, that's so creepy. After Jen told her mother this story, she was expecting her mom to be a little bit horrified by it, because it is a pretty startling story about her own child. But Jen's thinking it's been so long since this happened and nothing came of it that her mom would probably quickly move on from it. But Jen noticed her mom looked very concerned, and she turned to her and she goes, "Mom, this happened like 2 decades ago. Like, this is not a big deal." And her mom looks down for a second and then looks up, and she has this look of guilt on her face. And she says to her daughter, "Jen, I should have told you this when it happened, but you were so young, and I felt like it was going to ruin your childhood. And so I just didn't tell you, and it seemed like you forgot about it, but obviously you didn't, and so I guess you got to hear the full story now." Jen's confused at this point, and she says, "What are you talking about?" And her mother, who now looked really uncomfortable, she's touching her face, and she looks very anxious, she says to Jen, "It's time you learned who that man really was." Before Jen could ask any more questions, her mom just says, "Honey, just sit down and I will explain everything to you." So they sit down, and Jen's mom is still acting pretty uncomfortable. This is obviously a difficult subject for her. And she starts by saying, "Okay, so do you remember how in our neighborhood where you grew up, everybody seemed to know each other? It was a really tight community of people." And Jen's like, "Yeah, I remember that." And her mom was like, "Well, because of that, it made it really easy to spot people that were, outsiders, that didn't live in the neighborhood. And so if a car came down the street and I didn't recognize it, I would find myself looking out the window and watching the car to see where it was going, because there's no reason to be in this neighborhood unless you're a visitor or you live here." And so I was in the habit of people watching anybody that showed up that I didn't recognize. And I know a bunch of the other mothers in the neighborhood did the same thing, one of them being Frankie's mom. Anyways, on the same day that creep came up to you and pinched your arm when you were 8 years old in 1995, well, that morning, Frankie's mom, Sonia, she happened to look out her front window and she saw a vehicle she didn't recognize. And it was a work van, a white work van. It didn't have windows in the back, and it was parked across the street near the pinecone forest. And so she assumed it must be a work truck, and whoever had brought it here was, working on one of the houses in the neighborhood. But where it was parked, it was not close to any one particular house. And there was lots of places you could have parked on the street. So it seemed odd, if you're going to be doing work on a house, that you wouldn't just park in front of the house. Like, why would you park, inconveniently farther away in front of this random forest? And so that got her thinking that something's up with this van. But she didn't think it was bad. She just was trying to make sense of it. And so all morning she found herself going to the window and looking out to see if someone was going to claim this van, but she never saw anybody go near it. She didn't see workers going in and out of it. She didn't see any activity that was related to the van. It was just this empty van parked randomly across the street. And by the afternoon, when still no one had claimed this vehicle, she was getting ready to call the police. So that same day, you and Frankie had spoken on the phone and planned to meet up at the pinecone forest after he was done with his homework. And he didn't tell his mom about these plans, and so she didn't know that you would be very close to this van. Had she have known that, she would have told you to not wait out there, but instead to come right inside and don't go near this van. So at some point in the afternoon, when Sonia's getting ready to call the police, and you were actually already over at the pinecone forest waiting for Frankie, Sonia's looking out the window and she sees the back 2 doors fly open, and that guy who pinched you jumps out of the back and starts running into the pinecone forest. And from where Sonia's looking, she can only see part of the forest. The other portion of it is to the right, that's out of her view through this window. And so she turns and runs in her house to the side window of her house, and she looks out at that section of the pinecone forest where this guy has run to, and she sees you standing in front of the tree, and she sees this guy sprint right up to you and sees him pinch you in the arm, and he's talking to you. And that's when she ran out onto the porch and yelled for you to come inside. And she would tell me later that when she did that, she tried to sound very natural. She was worried if she sounded like this was an emergency, not only would it frighten you, but it might trigger this stranger to grab you or take you, because now he's been made. Someone realizes he's a bad guy and he might take you. And so the whole time she's watching you, she was watching him to see if he was going to chase you. And so when you came inside, she did her best to be totally calm and told you to go play with Frankie. And as soon as you were out of the room, she ran around the house and locked all the doors, all the windows, and then called me. And we decided it made sense to call the police. Even though you were safely in the house, we didn't know who this guy was, and it seemed like he was intentionally targeting you, like he was waiting for you the whole time. And so Sonia calls the police, and a police cruiser was sent over to our neighborhood, and they quickly found the white van that matched the description. They pull up next to it, and they walk to the driver's side, and sitting inside the car is a man that matches the description of what Sonia gave, and he's acting really weird. You know, he looked like he was on drugs, or maybe he was drunk, or something was wrong with him. Something was off about him. And so the officers had him step out of the car, and they search his car, and in the front two seats, there was nothing but, you know, cigarette butts and trash. And there was a partition wall between the front two seats and the back workspace of the van. They went around to the back of the van, and they see this guy has screwed a latch onto the back of the two doors right across the middle, and there's a padlock through it. So there's an additional lock on this back door. Clearly, he doesn't want anybody getting in the back of this thing. And so the police turn to this guy, and they're like, "We need to get in the back of your truck. Can you please open this?" And at first he was, you know, making excuses why he couldn't open it, but finally he relented and pulled out a special keychain he was carrying that had two distinct keys on it. And he used one of them to undo the padlock. He opened that up, and then he swung open the doors and he backed up. And the police look inside, and they can't believe what they're looking at. Inside of this van, all over every surface in the back, were pictures of you taped to the walls, to the ground, to the back. I mean, everywhere you looked, there was a picture of you. And they weren't just recent pictures of you. There was at least a couple pictures of you when you were 6 years old, and you were 8 when he approached you. So we know he was following you for at least 2 years. Also in the back of the van were binoculars, as well as a camera that presumably he was using to take these pictures of you. But that's not even the worst part. After this guy got arrested, one of the officers pulled out that keychain that had the key to the padlock on the back of his van, and he noticed the other key on the keychain was not just a duplicate key to the same padlock. It was a different, unique key. And so the police go over to this guy, and they show him the key, and they say, "What is this to?" And he says, "It's to my storage locker." And so the police track down a storage locker, and they go over there, and they unlock the lock with the key. And they open the door, and what's inside is straight out of a nightmare. The entire storage locker, the ceiling, the floor, the walls, all of it was covered in clear plastic wrap. And behind the plastic wrap, you could see on the walls were hundreds more pictures of you. And in the middle of the storage locker was a dentist chair that had been anchored to the ground. Next to the dentist chair was this silver tray like you would see in a dentist's office, except on it were all these knives. And they were not surgical or medical knives. They were like meat cleavers and hunting knives, crude instruments. And then next to that on a table was an anatomy book where he had used printouts of you to bookmark different parts of the book that he was taking notes on and highlighting, all of which had to do with the female anatomy. In the back of the locker was a rotted mattress that was just sitting on the ground, and anchored in the back on the wall were chains with handcuffs extending off of them, and then next to the bed were dozens of empty 5-gallon drums. When the police showed us pictures of the inside of his van, we were very shaken up. It was just so awful to imagine someone taking advantage of you in that way, you know, watching you. But when they showed us pictures of the chamber that he had created inside of his storage locker, that's just something I'll never get over. He clearly had plans for you. After hearing this story from her mother, Jen is a mixture of angry with her mom for not telling her sooner, but also sad, you know, that her mom had to go through that with her child, because now Jen is a mother, and she can only imagine how horrible that must have been for her then and even still now. And so all Jen could think to do was give her mom a hug. After they embraced, Jen asked her mom, you know, what happened to this guy? You know, where is he? Did he go to jail? And her mom told her that he had confessed to stalking Jen, and he confessed that everything they found in the storage locker in his van was his, and that he understood the implications, but he never gave his real motives for it or really what his intentions were. He was ultimately put into a high security mental institution for the criminally insane, and her mom said she has no idea if he's still alive or if he's been transferred, but that was the last she knew about him. And so Jen wound up doing some homework and figured out where he was being held, and she asked to have a meeting with him because she wanted to ask him to his face what were you planning to do to me? I want to know why you did this. And he agreed to take this meeting, but the day before they were supposed to have it, he took his own life. And so Jen doesn't know if that was brought on by their impending meeting. It certainly seems likely, but unfortunately, that's it. She doesn't get any more answers, and it will end with a big question mark of, what was he going to do to me? And why?
I saw you cross the floor, tacones on the tile, gold in your smile and trouble in your eyes. You spun me like a vow, then left me in the dust. I should've known it then, you're fire when you touch. Hold on, don't let me fall. You pull me close, then you take it all. Hold on, say my name slow. One little look and I won't let go. Tacones y fuego.
So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, tell us in the comments what it is and where it is. Give us the timestamp of where you found it. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please take the like button's email address and sign them up for the following two newsletters: the Bulgarian Michael Jackson fan club and the German axolotl fish fan club. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications